We are less than a week away from the New Hampshire primary, and here with the pulse of the people is the Hill's national political reporter and author of the 1230 report, Cate Martel. Kate, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Julia.
So, Kate, just to jump into it, the #1 issue for Americans nationally is the economy. But a recent poll shows New Hampshire voters are actually most concerned about democracy. And for New Hampshire, the economy only came in third. So you're from New Hampshire. You've spent a lot of time there. Is that surprising to you? And why do you think democracy came out on top?
Yeah, first of all, Julia, it is pretty surprising that that would come out on top above the economy, because a lot of voters I'm talking to do bring up the economy. But time after time, what is coming up with almost every New Hampshire voter I talk to is that they are concerned about the congressional dysfunction and, what's been going on in Washington, that they don't necessarily think that Washington represents them, that they're concerned about the future of democracy, that is coming up time and time again. And, most pointedly, January 6th is often coming up, that is an issue that I think really irked a lot of New Hampshire voters. And, we're watching from a distance and seeing, what's been happening in Washington. And, most importantly, too, the fact that there has been nonstop political chaos going on for the past decade. And I think a lot of Americans, particularly in New Hampshire, are feeling it. That New Hampshire is not necessarily wants to be talking about politics all the time, but since in the past decade, you kind of see it coming up at Thanksgiving dinners, on the sidelines of a Little League game, that all the people are talking about is politics, and they seem, frankly, pretty saturated by it. So, it's fascinating that the future of democracy would be the top answer in this type of poll, because you do see the economy also hitting people hard with inflation. But, it also, I think, points to why Nikki Haley and Chris Christie are making big plays in this state. Right. They've been running campaigns not necessarily aligning with former President Trump, and you see that reflected, that they want something new, they want something different, even Republicans. And that's why I think that we're seeing Nikki Haley having a moment in the state, and why Chris Christie did make a big play in the state.
And we'll get to Nikki Haley standing in the state in a moment. But when you look at the breakdown on democracy between Democrats and Republicans, how does that look?
Yeah, so when you actually break it down, that some Republicans are concerned about the future of democracy. It doesn't necessarily just pointedly, point to Republicans or, former President Trump's, controversial administration to some Democrats and independents. It also, I think, points to some of this congressional dysfunction. But I think even more importantly, most Democrats, almost nearly half of Democrats, said that was their top concern. That tells me a lot. That tells me that they want something new and they're looking for a change in the state.
Immigration came in as the second biggest concern for New Hampshire voters, which is interesting because they're nowhere near the border. I experienced the same thing in Iowa talking to voters. That was at least a top 2 concern for a lot of caucus goers in that state. But what does that tell you, that so many New Hampshire voters are concerned about the situation at the U.S. southern border?
Yeah, it's so fascinating that, like you said, that New Hampshire is nowhere near the U.S.-Mexico border. It does touch the Canadian border, but that's not the issue at hand. And that a lot of particularly Republicans are very concerned about what's happening on the border. A lot of New Hampshire voters that I'm talking to are concerned about national security and foreign policy issues. And I think that ties into it, that when we're talking about border security, they're worried about, I think, some of the influx of some immigrants coming in. And I think some of that is reflected. And then I think more broadly, when you talk about immigration, that's been a big issue for Republicans, particularly in the past decade. If we look back to 2016, it was all about build the wall. That has always been kind of red meat for Republicans. And then I think that message has evolved in the past few years to border security. We've seen, I think, this influx of migrants at the border. And there's been, I think, Republicans have been pretty critical of the Biden administration on how they've handled relations between the U.S. and Mexico border. And I think we're seeing that reflected. And that's why I think a lot of those Republicans would say that they are voting against the Biden administration because they don't like how that's being handled.
And you know, the biggest national story right now in terms of politics is the Republican presidential primary, but there's some drama for Democrats and New Hampshire Democrats right now. I mean, the national Democrats and the New Hampshire Democrats. There's a write-in Biden campaign to try and keep New Hampshire's first in the nation primary status. Break this all down for me. How did we get here, and will it ultimately work?
Yeah, it's fascinating, Julia. First of all, that this was a time that I think Democrats thought that they wanted to expand who had the first in the nation, status, and they wanted to make it a more diverse state than they would argue Iowa and New Hampshire. Iowa basically said, okay, that's fine. We will move our date. But New Hampshire is absolutely fighting back time and time and again. Every New Hampshire voter that I've been talking to, every family member, every family friend, when I'm going up there time and time again, the issue that keeps coming up is how mad that they are that the DNC is taking away the first in the nation primary status. New Hampshire has had this coveted role for a century and takes it very, very seriously. What's different about retail politics in New Hampshire versus a lot of states that happen later, for example, Super Tuesday, is that candidates have to go answer one-on-one questions from voters. They're going to libraries, breweries, diner visits, going to town halls with just a few number of people. Sometimes they'll show up at a school and people feel like they're being heard. It's not just polished debates. It's not just political ads playing. It's not just pre-chosen questions at, an aired town hall event. That New Hampshire takes it very seriously. So now there is still a fight between the national party and between New Hampshire. New Hampshire is not taking it lightly, and they are trying to fight back and hold on to having the date. And that's why there's still a write-in campaign because, to have Joe Biden won't necessarily be on the ballot. But I think that some Democrats that want to hold on to it are trying to put this write-in campaign in. And I think interesting anecdote to show you just how important this is to New Hampshire voters, that the two states' Democratic senators, the same party as President Biden, actually skipped a White House event in December because they were so angry and from hearing from so many constituents they didn't want the primary moved, that they actually, bowed out of an event that, most of their colleagues went to in honor of showing that they were fighting for New Hampshire. So, I think it's really hit a nerve that in any reporting that I've been doing, that is time and time again the issue that seems to come up the most. It has really, I think, angered a lot of Republicans and Democrats alike. And I think they're really trying to hold on to it, even though that's not necessarily what the national party wants, because they want to expand it out and, have some more diverse representation than just New Hampshire and Iowa.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough for our viewers who aren't familiar with Iowa and New Hampshire politics how important and consequential that first in the nation status is to them. But what's the biggest difference between Iowa voters and New Hampshire voters from your perspective, and who will that benefit the most?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, Julia, the biggest difference, I think, is how politically conservative. Iowa voters are much more deeply conservative, a lot more evangelical. New Hampshire voters, particularly Republicans, I think lean more libertarian. They're probably a little less religious than I would argue that a lot of Iowa voters are. So the way that a campaign would run in Iowa is very different than how it would run in New Hampshire. The issues that matter that we've been discussing have not been the social issues. That those have been, I think, very important to some other states. But in New Hampshire in particular, I think this could absolutely help Nikki Haley. That the reason, as I was saying earlier, that Chris Christie was running his campaign, his entire MO was to make sure that former President Trump was not president again. And he was running as a very moderate Republican. So when he dropped out, I would argue a lot of his support is likely going to Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley hasn't been, running as much of an anti-Trump campaign as Chris Christie has, but she also hasn't been running toe-to-toe with former President Trump. And she runs, I think, a much more moderate campaign. New Hampshire voters are pretty concerned with national security, like we were talking about with immigration and the border. And Nikki Haley is the former United Nations ambassador. That I think that they think she has a lot of credentials and, a lot of confidence when it comes to foreign policy. So I think they see her as a bit of change, while not necessarily with Chris Christie just making his entire campaign about that. And I think the biggest difference, when you look between those two voters, is how politically moderate that they are.
Right, right. And before we go, speaking of that ground game, you're from New Hampshire and you were there for the holidays. So I wanted to ask if you got anything interesting in the mail, and wanted to get your take on how inundated voters are getting right now with mailers, ads, that kind of a thing.
Oh, Julia, people are completely inundated. That, just those photos of just a few of the mailers that my family received in a short period of time, that every day they're getting piles and piles of these mailers. And being home over the holidays, you turn on the TV, you can't make it through an entire commercial break without seeing a political ad. It is ad after ad, even subsequently arguing back and forth with each other. But I also think what's interesting that I've noticed and have heard other people say is that anecdotally, people aren't seeing as many lawn signs around as they had been seeing in previous campaigns. And I think that probably shows that, voters maybe aren't as excited as they have been in the past when, you have a lot of candidates running, you have an open primary with a lot, no presumptive front runner. And from the people I'm talking to, haven't been putting out as many lawn signs. They just don't seem excited in the way that they seem. But that being said, there are tons of these ads, tons of these mailers, and I think they're going to continue to get inundated for the next week.
'Tis the season. Cate Martel, thank you so much, and I will see you in New Hampshire.
See you there, Julia.
That's it for What's America Thinking. Come back next week. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel. Also, make sure to comment and let us know what's got you fired up in your region of the country. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.